One of the big questions has been, does election day mean election day? Does it mean election days, election weeks, election months? Issue is, it arose actually out of Mississippi, getting up to the Fifth Circuit, is you have all these jurisdictions that in 2020 allowed ballots to be received after the close of the polls on election day. This was the great complaint about all the ballots that showed up in Pennsylvania and Michigan, Wisconsin, bringing in the ballots they're pulling out from underneath the desk in Georgia. A lot of questions about when were those ballots properly received, when were they properly counted. Georgia famously kept counting 99.9% of the ballots for like 2 weeks, it seemed. It was like, hold on a second. How's there another 0.1%? How's there another 0.1%? Some of those issues are made more problematic by the ability to have a ballot counted, like in Nevada, like in California, like in Mississippi, like in some other states, even if it is not received by the election official until days and days after the election.
So long as it was post dated prior to election day?
Yes, but as the court pointed out, under federal postal rules, you can retract anything you've sent in the mail. They can send it back to you, and then you can put it back in the mail again, and it still have the prior postmark date. There's actually no guarantee that the person's even voting before election day merely because it's postmarked by or before election day. And then, of course, you have the concern of postal workers who just backdating postal dates. Well, I mean, again, they're finding rogue postal workers in Pennsylvania, postal workers in Georgia, other places. You can't, I mean, again, the union that represents postal workers has endorsed the Harris campaign for president.
And hold on, I'm not going crazy. There was a scandal of a whistleblower back in 2020 who said he was ordered to backdate ballots that were received that they were stamping afterwards, and then the person retracted the statement. I remember this leading
They were
to a
put under
lawsuit.
massive pressure. James O'Keefe talked to them
Yep,
for a period of
that's
time.
right.
That but there's just no guarantee of it. Given as long as you're allowed to receive ballots after election day, you open the door to fraudulent ballots. In other words, ballots that were not in fact filled out by election day. And the issue goes, does that violate the law? So the U.S. Constitution has two provisions for determining when an election can take place: the Electors Clause and the Elections Clause. Both of them give to Congress the power to determine when an election can be done. And for those unfamiliar with the history, we didn't used to have ballots. People used to go and vote in person, raise their hand. That we went to the secret ballot. The official narrative is we did this to prevent the chaos and da-da-da. No, we didn't. We did it to screw over populist political machines and immigrant political machines because they were handing out ballots that people could go and put in rather than having to fill it out otherwise. Also, once the state had a monopoly on a ballot, they would use it as an excuse to decide who has to go in or not on a ballot, as we've seen in all the crazy Robert Kennedy cases this year. 1 minute excluding him, next minute forcing him on the ballot against his own will. So that's really what the scam was. But the broader history is that we always had an election day, and that throughout from 1800 through 1880, there have been various efforts by jurisdictions to maneuver around the rules. In fact, all the way through the 1990s, where you could actually have election day be different than when Congress said it. So what Congress did is they said, we're not going to have any of this. There has to be one election day. And for the presidency, one election day for any federal office. And in fact, it has to be the same day in presidential years. And then you have for the House, you have every 2 years, you have other offices that get elected and so forth. But it has to be just one election day. Now, how do you allow early voting? They said that election day is when the ballot is received. So as long as you're voting before then, that can be part of election day. Doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but it's how the courts came up with the excuse. They said all that mattered is the ballot has to be received by the day designated by Congress. But these ballots are not being received by the day denominated by Congress. So the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals came in and said, well, that's illegal. That violates the U.S. Constitution and federal law. Constitution, because it gives to Congress that power, and they're trying to usurp it at the state level, that you've got to return the ballot by the close of the polls, and note by the close of the polls, not postmarked that day so they can show up after midnight like it did in Pennsylvania, like it did in Michigan, like it did in Wisconsin, where they saw the trucks coming in with the ballots in the back. It has to be received before the close of the polls, which Florida's rules and others reflect this, and they don't have problems counting ballots or anything else. So what it means is this federal court has ruled not only Mississippi's rules are illegal and unconstitutional, so are Nevada's, so are California's. Now, they're not enforcing it for this election because they don't like to interrupt an election. But it won't change the fact that any ballots received after Election Day, now there's federal appellate precedent saying those ballots can't be counted because it violates federal law to allow them to be counted.
I'm not going crazy. I was trying to find news from 2020. This was an issue where they were counting ballots that were received within 4 days, 7 days of 2020.
Pennsylvania one went back up and down before the Supreme Court.
Well, hold on, but
U.S. Supreme Court never resolved the question.
Okay, and so that's what I was going to say. That issue was not adjudicated on the merits, obviously, in 2020, which is now we're getting Fifth Circuit Federal Court of. So there are circumstances in which the Federal Court of Appeal can override a state's voting or counting procedure.
Well, I mean, they're declaring whether or not these ballots can be counted legally, and they're saying these ballots are illegal. Now, what happens to that in terms of enforcement is an open question. But in my view, it means every candidate in any state where they try to count ballots after not received by the close of the polls has grounds to petition the court to require the local election officials to set those ballots aside. Say, look, if any of those ballots come in, even if state law allows it, put them aside, don't count them yet, because we believe they're all illegal ballots. And maybe it won't matter. Maybe the election will be so determinative that all of the ballots, even if they voted for the same candidate, couldn't change the outcome. But I think in every state that allows ballots now to be received after the close of the polls, every candidate has grounds to challenge and not allow those ballots to be counted until that issue is resolved, unless it's made moot by the election results based on this decision.
So that is a big white pill where people got to get their votes in beforehand and make sure they're received if they want to avoid any potential problems.
I mean, that's what they learned in Arizona, that was that if you waited till Election Day like they did in 2020, if they did that again in 2022, what could happen is they could squirrel around and people would, not get their vote in. That's why this time around, Republicans wisely chose mostly in-person early voting. In some states like Pennsylvania, the only thing that's really available is mail. So you had more people mail in their ballots, though there's still some Republican skepticism about that. But where it's available, I always encourage in-person early voting is the best way to do it. So you don't have to worry about something going squirrely on Election Day.